You didn't make a sound. That's the part that stays with you. You weren't sobbing. You weren't calling out to him. You were just standing there, in the corner of the stall, back against the wood, arms folded tight against your chest. The way you hold yourself together when everything inside is coming apart. And the tears were quiet, the kind that fall before you even realize you're crying. And then he moved. He had been standing across the stall, calm, facing away. But something shifted. You heard the slow drag of hooves on the ground, felt the warmth of him before you saw him coming. And then his nose was at your shoulder. Not pushing, not demanding anything from you. Just there, resting, breathing with the kind of steadiness that makes your own breath try to follow. You didn't know what to do with that. You still don't, fully. So most people who've spent real time with horses have a moment like this. A moment that doesn't fit neatly into any category they have for what animals are capable of. It wasn't a trained behavior. It wasn't a cue you gave. You hadn't asked for anything. You were just broken, quietly, in a place you thought was private. And somehow, without a word, without a gesture, the horse knew. The question most people never ask is, how? Not in the sentimental way. Not the animals just sense things answer that gets passed around like a warm blanket, like it explains something just by sounding comforting. The real question, the biological question, the one that asks, what is actually happening inside a horse's body and brain when you cry near them? What are they detecting? How are they processing it? And what does it mean, scientifically, and not just emotionally, that they move toward you instead of away? Because the answer isn't what you think. It is stranger and more precise, and in some ways more moving than anything the sentimental version could offer you. And once you understand it, you will never stand next to a horse the same way again. Let's start with what we assume. When a horse comes to you while you're crying, the instinct is to call it empathy. And in the broadest sense, that's not wrong. But it's so incomplete that it almost misleads you. We use the word empathy the way we use words when we want to feel understood, without having to go further. We say, "He felt my pain," and we let that be the whole story. We are warmed by the idea. We are not changed by the reality. But there is a reality underneath the idea. And it begins not with emotion, it begins with chemistry. Specifically, it begins with the nose. A horse's olfactory system is not simply more powerful than ours, in the way that a louder speaker is more powerful than a quieter one. It is different in kind, different in architecture. Horses possess a specialized structure called the vomeronasal organ, sometimes referred to as Jacobson's organ, situated in the roof of the mouth and connected by direct neural pathways to the limbic system. The limbic system is the part of the brain responsible for emotional memory, social bonding, and the processing of biologically significant information. It is one of the oldest parts of the mammalian brain. It is where meaning lives. When a horse curls back its upper lip in that strange, almost theatrical expression, the one that looks, say to human eyes, like the horse is laughing at a joke you didn't hear. It is not being expressive in a whimsical sense. That behavior is called the Flamen response, and it is a deliberate physiological act. The horse is closing off the nasal airflow and forcing air directly into the vomeronasal organ, allowing chemical information to be analyzed at a depth and precision that has no parallel in human sensory experience. The horse is not just smelling. The horse is reading. Now consider this. Human tears are not chemically neutral. Tears contain proteins, hormones, and neuroactive compounds, whose concentrations shift depending on the emotional state that produced them. The tears you shed when you're chopping onions are chemically different from the tears you shed when you're grieving. And the tears that fall when you're frightened carry different compound profiles than the tears that fall when you're overwhelmed with joy. Scientists have identified specific protein markers, including prolactin, adrenocorticotropin, and leucine and kephalin, that appear in emotionally produced tears in ways they do not appear in irritant-produced tears. These compounds carry emotional information encoded at a molecular level, and horses, with that extraordinary vomeronasal architecture, are designed to detect chemical signals at concentrations far below what any current instrument can reliably measure. The threshold of their chemical perception is not just lower than ours, it exists in a range that we, frankly, cannot fully map. What this means is that when you are standing in that stall and the quiet tears are falling, before you have moved, before your voice has changed, before your posture has shifted in any way you're conscious of, your horse has already received a signal. Specific, unmistakable, carrying information that says, something has changed in this person. Something is wrong that wasn't wrong before. Something is happening that requires a response. He didn't guess. He didn't interpret. He read data that your body was broadcasting without your permission or awareness. That is the foundation of everything that follows. Now let's go to the research, because the chemistry is only the beginning. A team of researchers at the University of Sussex, led by animal behavior scientist Karen McComb, and began a series of studies that would fundamentally shift how cognitive scientists understand the social and emotional intelligence of horses. McComb's team had already established, through careful experimental design, that horses could recognize and respond meaningfully to human facial expressions in still photographs. That showing a horse a photograph of an angry human face produced measurable increases in heart rate and a characteristic left gaze bias, while photographs of calm or happy faces produced no such response. The horses had never been trained for this. They simply possessed the capacity. It was not a party trick. It was a window into something much larger. The left gaze bias is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most significant findings in comparative animal cognition of the last 2 decades. When an animal gazes at something with its left eye, it is routing that visual information through the right hemisphere of the brain. And in the brains of horses, as in the brains of humans, dogs, and many other social mammals, the right hemisphere is the hemisphere that specializes in processing stimuli that are emotionally significant, socially complex, or potentially threatening. It is the hemisphere that asks, does this matter? Is this something I need to respond to? It is the hemisphere of attentiveness, not just perception. When horses showed a left gaze bias to photographs of angry human faces, they were not simply reacting to a novel visual stimulus. They were flagging that stimulus as emotionally meaningful. They were saying, in the language of their neurology, this face carries information about emotional state, and that information matters to me.
Hey there, easy
McComb's team then moved from visual stimuli to auditory ones. They exposed horses to audio recordings of different human vocalizations, neutral speech, laughter, and crying, and measured behavioral responses with careful attention to gaze direction, heart rate variability, and general arousal levels. The question they were asking was precise. Can horses distinguish the emotional content of human vocalizations? Not just the volume or novelty of a sound, but the emotional meaning encoded within it. The results were unambiguous. When exposed to recordings of human crying, horses showed a response pattern that was measurably and consistently distinct from their responses to other sounds. The left gaze bias appeared again, the right hemisphere engaged, the emotionally significant processing activated. And heart rate shifted, behavioral arousal increased. The horses were not startled the way they are startled by sudden or unfamiliar mechanical sounds. The high-headed, wide-eyed, ready-to-flee alertness of a surprised prey animal. What the researchers observed was something quieter and more directed, an attentiveness, an orientation, the kind of focused, calm engagement that horses display toward things they recognize as socially significant rather than environmentally threatening. And then, critically, many of the horses approached the source of the sound. The approach was not anxious. It was not aggressive. It was the slow, low-headed, ears-forward movement that horses use with one another when a herd member is distressed. It was, in every behavioral marker the researchers had available to assess it, a comfort response, or a reaching toward. A "this is something I can help with, and I am going there" response. They were not performing this behavior. No reward structure had been established. No training protocol had shaped it. The horses were simply doing what their social cognition, honed over millennia, moved them to do when they detected distress in a being they recognized as part of their social world. If this is already changing how you see your horse, subscribe to the Horse Soul. Because what's coming in the second half of this is even harder to sit with, and even more worth knowing. There is a second layer to this story, and it involves a capacity in horses that most owners significantly underestimate. It involves memory. Research conducted at INRAE, the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food, and Environment, by equine cognition scientists, including Léa Lansat and her colleagues, produced findings about horse memory and emotional learning that have quietly reshaped how veterinary behaviorists and equine scientists think about long-term horse-human relationships. The research demonstrated, through controlled experimental conditions, that horses retain detailed memories of specific humans and specific emotional interactions across time spans of months and years. This is not the generalized recognition of a familiar scent or silhouette. It is specific emotional memory. Memory that encodes not just who a person is, but what emotional valence their past interactions carried. A horse who has experienced a frightening interaction with a specific person, not a traumatic event in the clinical sense, or just a consistently tense or unpredictable human presence, will show measurable physiological indicators of stress when that person reappears, even after long absences. Heart rate elevations, behavioral tension, a readiness to move away. The body remembers what the experience taught it, and it prepares accordingly. But the same mechanism operates in the other direction with the same fidelity. Horses remember gentleness. They remember the person who moved slowly and spoke quietly during a frightening veterinary procedure. They remember the voice that stayed calm when something loud happened in the barn. They remember the human who sat with them in the dark when they were sick and didn't ask anything in return. They build what the researchers describe as individualized emotional profiles of the humans in their lives. Portraits made not of faces or names, but of emotional signatures, accumulated across repeated interactions over time. What this means for the moment in the stall, your moment, the one you're thinking about right now, is this. When your horse comes to you while you're crying, he is not responding to a distressed stranger. He is responding to you, to your biochemical signature that he has memorized across every day you have spent together, to the specific baseline of your emotional state that he carries as a reference point, against which he is now reading a significant deviation. He knows what you smell like when you are well, and he knows, with a precision that you cannot replicate or fake, that right now you are not well, or he is not offering generic comfort to a distressed creature. He is coming specifically to you. That is a different thing. That is something worth sitting with for a moment. The INRAE research also examined a phenomenon researchers call emotional contagion, the involuntary transmission and mirroring of emotional states between members of a social group. Emotional contagion is considered, in cognitive science, one of the foundational building blocks of empathy. Before an animal can empathize in the full cognitive sense, before it can understand that another creature is experiencing something and feel moved to respond. It must first be capable of catching that emotional state, of having it enter the body and register as something real. Emotional contagion is the bridge between perception and response. In horses, say emotional contagion within the herd is well documented and extraordinarily rapid. When one horse detects a threat, not even a visible, identifiable threat, but the chemical and behavioral signatures of fear in a nearby herd member, the emotional state propagates through the group within seconds. Heart rates synchronize, cortisol levels shift. The entire herd moves into a state of alert, not because every horse saw the source of danger, but because one horse felt it, and the others could not help but feel it too. The feeling is contagious in the most literal biological sense. What Lansade and her colleagues then investigated was whether this same mechanism extended across the species boundary, whether a horse in genuine proximity to a distressed human would show measurable physiological evidence of emotional contagion, not just behavioral responses like approaching, but internal physiological ones. Whether the horse's body would, in some measurable sense, carry a version of what the human was feeling. The data said yes. Horses in proximity to humans experiencing genuine emotional distress showed elevated heart rate variability patterns, consistent with increased arousal and emotional engagement. Horses in proximity to calm, regulated humans showed lower baseline stress markers even in environments that would typically produce mild baseline stress. The human's emotional state was not staying inside the human. It was crossing into the horse's physiology in ways that were measurable and reproducible. That this means, and I want you to hold this carefully because it is genuinely extraordinary. When you stand next to your horse and you cry, he does not merely know that you are sad. He becomes, in a measurable biological sense, a little sad with you. He absorbs the emotional state. He carries a version of it in his own body. The grief is shared, not just observed, and then he turns toward it. He moves into it, toward you, with deliberateness, with the slow, considered movement of an animal, making a choice rather than reacting to a stimulus. This is the part that the science can describe, but cannot fully explain. Because it requires a prey animal, a creature whose deepest evolutionary architecture is built around the imperative to flee from anything that signals danger or vulnerability, to override that architecture, to take the signal of distress, which in his nervous system is registered as something significant and potentially threatening, and respond to it by coming closer rather than creating distance. He does that. Your horse does that. And he does it for you specifically, because you are in his emotional memory, because your distress is filed not under unknown threat, but under my person is hurting, and because somewhere in the 6,000 years of history between horses and the humans who needed them, that distinction became one that horses can make. Take a moment with that, because I think most of us, even those who have loved horses for decades, have not fully allowed ourselves to feel what that means. Now let's talk about what you do with this, because understanding something is only valuable if it changes something. And there are 3 specific things this research can change about how you are with your horse. The first is something that may feel counterintuitive if you've spent years absorbing the conventional wisdom of the horse world. Let yourself be present, including when that presence is difficult. The training culture around horses has long emphasized calm leadership, the idea that horses need their human to be a stable, regulated presence, and that bringing emotional volatility into the barn is disruptive and unhelpful. There is real truth in this. A human who is genuinely dysregulated, erratic, unpredictable, moving with the jagged energy of someone in acute crisis, can in fact produce stress in a sensitive horse. This is real and worth respecting. But there is a significant difference between dysregulation and authentic emotion. Between the chaotic, unpredictable energy of a person who is falling apart and the quiet, coherent sadness of a person who is simply, genuinely hurting. The first can destabilize a horse who reads the environment for safety information. The second, the research is telling us, does not. In fact, quiet emotional authenticity in a known human often produces the opposite effect. In horses who are securely bonded to them, increased attentiveness, increased orientation toward, increased offering of proximity and contact. And here is what the research confirms about the mask you might be wearing. It isn't working anyway. The chemistry is already in the air. Whatever emotional state you carried into that barn is already encoded in the molecular information your body is releasing, and your horse has already read it. The calm voice, so the straight spine, the deliberate slow movements, they are useful and worth maintaining for the sake of your own regulation. But they are not hiding anything from him. He knows. He knew when you walked in. And the mask creates a small, unnecessary gap between what is actually happening in the shared space and what you are pretending is happening. A gap that horses, sensitive to authenticity above almost everything else, are aware of in their own way. You don't need to perform okayness for your horse. He's not asking for that. He's asking if we can use that word for you. The actual you. The one who is here in this moment, with whatever this moment contains. The second thing is to receive what he offers without immediately redirecting it. What horses who move toward a distressed human are doing something that costs them something. They are overriding a deep instinctual pull toward distance from anything that signals vulnerability. When your horse does this, and you immediately pick up the lead rope, or reach for the brush, or redirect the interaction into a task, you are sending a message that registers in his emotional memory, not as a rejection in the way a human would experience rejection, but as information, as a pattern, as, when I offer this, the response is to move away from it. Horses who receive this pattern repeatedly over time do adjust their behavior, not out of indifference, not because they stop perceiving your distress, but because the social feedback they've received has told them this offering is not welcomed here. And horses are deeply intelligent about social feedback. They update their behavioral templates based on what the relationship has taught them. If your horse offers you proximity and quiet presence in a moment of pain, let it be a moment, not forever. Not a training session in emotional receptivity, just a moment where you are both present with what's actually happening, without task, without agenda, without the noise of productivity. That moment is not wasted time. It is exactly the kind of interaction that the research suggests deepens the long-term bond between a human and a horse in ways that no amount of groundwork or positive reinforcement can replicate or replace. Because training builds a working relationship. A shared emotional presence builds something that doesn't have a clean name in the training literature, but that every person who has a deep bond with a horse recognizes immediately. He knows me, not just my cues and my routines. Me. The third thing is perhaps the most uncomfortable to sit with, and I'm going to ask you to sit with it anyway. Consider what your regular emotional climate is doing to your horse. If emotional contagion flows from human to horse, and it does, measurably and physiologically, then your chronic emotional state is not a private matter that stays inside your nervous system while you're in the barn. It enters the shared space. It becomes, in a very real physiological sense, part of what your horse is living in. Acute distress, a hard day, a difficult week, a grief that you're moving through, is not what I'm describing. Horses bonded to their humans are not fragile in the face of human emotion. They are built for it, in some sense, by the very evolutionary history we've been talking about. They can hold a person's bad day. They can offer steadiness into someone's grief. This is, as the research shows, quite literally what they evolved to do in relationship with us. What's worth examining is something more sustained: chronic anxiety that never finds resolution. A long-running, low-grade emotional stress that is always present, always just underneath the surface, never acknowledged or worked through. Emotional suppression that has become so habitual, it no longer registers as suppression. It just feels like the normal way of moving through the world. Horses who live within that kind of sustained emotional climate, with a primary human who carries unresolved chronic stress, do sometimes show it in their bodies and behavior. Trainers describe them as waiting for something bad to happen. Veterinary behaviorists note hypersensitivity that doesn't resolve with training because it doesn't originate in training. The horse is not broken. The horse is regulated to the emotional environment he lives in. And sometimes that environment is carrying something that the human has not yet found a way to put down. This is not blame. It is an invitation. An invitation to consider your horse not only as a being who receives your care in the practical sense, the feeding, the veterinary attention, the clean stall, so the appropriate exercise, but as a being who participates in your emotional life in a way that is literal and mutual and physiological. The relationship is more reciprocal than most frameworks of horse care acknowledge. You are affecting him. He is affecting you. That exchange is happening every day, in every moment you are in proximity, whether or not either of you is consciously aware of it. Becoming conscious of it is where something changes. Before I bring you to the last piece of this, drop a comment right now. Tell me your horse's name and the one moment when you felt certain that he understood something about you that you hadn't said out loud. I read every single one. There's something I keep returning to at the end of all of this research. Something that the scientists describe in their papers in careful, measured, well, not precise language, but that refuses to stay careful and measured once it's fully in your mind. Horses evolved alongside humans for roughly 6,000 years of documented domestication. The relationship is older in the broader sense. Hominids and equids have shared landscapes for far longer, as the geological record makes clear. But it is in those 6,000 years of genuine cohabitation, of working beside each other, depending on each other, reading each other across the profound difference of species. It is in that time that something happened that is, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, almost improbable. A prey animal, a creature whose survival across millions of years of evolutionary history depended entirely on reading threat correctly and responding to it by running. That animal developed the capacity to read human emotional states with specificity and nuance, to differentiate grief from anger, distress from neutral calm, to respond to grief not by moving away, which is what the deepest instinctual logic of a prey animal would prescribe, but by moving toward. To offer what can only be described, in the fullest sense of the word, as comfort. The evolutionary pressure that produced this is not fully understood. The researchers are honest about this. It is possible that horses who were sensitive to the emotional states of their humans were more effectively used, better cared for, and more likely to survive in the context of domestication, that there was a selection pressure for emotional attunement that ran alongside the selection pressures for speed and strength and trainability. It is possible that the long proximity itself, the sheer accumulated hours of shared life between horses and humans across those thousands of years, produced something like attunement through a different mechanism entirely, through the kind of deep familiarity that reshapes neural architecture over generations. What the researchers can say with confidence is this:
Can you hear me?
the capacity exists. It is documented. It is reproducible. It is specific and sophisticated in ways that cannot be explained away by conditioning or coincidence. Horses recognize human emotional expressions. They process human emotional vocalizations in the hemisphere of the brain, designated for socially significant information. They experience emotional contagion with humans. They maintain long-term emotional memories of specific humans. And they approach, not retreat, when a known human is in distress. This is the animal you have chosen to love. This is the animal standing in the barn right now, in his stall, with his particular smell and his particular sounds, and his particular way of turning to look at you when you come through the door. He has been tracking you all this time, across all the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones, the days when you were fine and the days when you were barely holding together. He has been tracking you. I'm building his understanding of you the way the research says horses build their understanding of the humans who matter to them, through emotional memory, through biochemical familiarity, through the accumulated data of shared presence. And on the days when the tears come before you can stop them, when you find yourself standing in the corner of the stall with your arms folded and your jaw tight and the quiet grief moving through you, he already knows. He knew when you walked in. He is already deciding, in whatever way a horse decides things, whether to come to you. And if your history together has given him reason to believe that coming to you is welcome, he will come. That is what 6,000 years produced. That is what is standing in the stall next to you. Not just a horse, not just an animal that you care for and train and love in the general way that one loves a creature one is responsible for. Something more specific than that. Something that chose, in the long conversation of evolution and domestication and daily life, to become the kind of being that moves toward human pain rather than away from it. You thought you were alone in that moment. You were not. You never were. If this video found you at the right moment, share it with someone who loves their horse. Someone who has had a moment like this and never quite knew what to do with it, or whether it was real, or whether they were imagining the depth of what they felt. They need to hear this. And I'll see you in the next one.